So I want to start by saying thank you, everyone, for coming. My name is Cody Armstrong, and today we're talking about using Onshape alongside SolidWorks, and SolidWorks specifically because there's a number of things that we can do that really help the SolidWorks user out. So I'm not going to focus so much today on Onshape's CAD tools, the CAD creation tools, but more all the data management and sharing and collaboration tools that are built into Onshape that can help the everyday SolidWorks user. As I always say with these webinars, we really encourage you to ask any questions that you'd like. There's a questions dialogue, and you go to webinar panel. Feel free to type in anything. I'll do my best to stop and address any questions that pop up. So again, feel free to type in anything you'd like. Before we get into the topic of the day, there are a few things about Onshape I'd like to mention. So for those new users out there, the first thing I always like to mention is our mission statement, and that is getting everyone working together with CAD on any device, anywhere. And this includes mobile devices. So if you haven't downloaded the Onshape app for Android or your iOS device, I definitely recommend it. It's a full-blown CAD editing tool, so it's not simply a view or a markup. You have real CAD creation tools on a mobile device. And it's not just mobile devices. Of course, it's any computer with a modern browser. This is Mac, Windows, Linux, Chromebooks. So you really do have accessibility from any computer with an internet connection. So everyone working together with CAD on any device, anywhere, that's our mission. Now, some other things I like to highlight about Onshape. The first is we do consider ourselves professional 3D CAD. When you think of professional 3D CAD, it's really three pieces: parts, assemblies, and of course drawings. And we do have all three major pieces that make up a professional 3D CAD system. Some things about Onshape that are unique. One of the first is, just how quickly we're evolving. You're going to see Onshape update very quickly. Roughly every 3 weeks, new functionality is being added. And the neatest thing from an end user perspective is it doesn't involve anything on your part. You don't have to install or upgrade or manage anything yourself. You simply log in and new features are there. Also with Onshape comes built-in version control, and this very much ties into what we're talking about here today with managing external data. With Onshape, you have version control built into the core, and we're going to focus a lot on that today. Also, very important to today's topic, the ability to read and write common CAD formats. So if you have a library of data, for instance, in SolidWorks format or any other format, Parasolid, Step, IGES, and so on, we can read that data in. We can also export a lot of the common CAD formats out there, including SolidWorks, Step, IGES, Parasolid, and a number of other formats, which we'll go over in just a bit. But very important to that working alongside workflow is the ability to both import and export all these neutral file formats, and even the native formats like SolidWorks, for example, which we're going to cover. But very important to what we're talking about here today, Onshape can read and write a lot of this standard industry CAD formats that are out there. And that also includes DXF and DWG and PDF as well. The last thing I want to mention is entirely new methods of collaboration. With Onshape, the same user, multiple users can be working on the same document at the same time. And you can view it from any modern browser. You can view it from your mobile device. So it really gives you a lot of accessibility and the ability to collaborate just about anywhere with anyone. Given that you've shared the document. So entirely new methods of collaboration with Onshape. We're going to cover a few examples of that in just a bit. So those are just some things about Onshape I like to highlight in general. What I'd like to do now is talk about what we're going to discuss here today. And the first thing, of course, that's worth mentioning is importing and exporting. How do we handle importing and exporting in Onshape? What formats are supported? How's the process work? And so on. So we're going to cover that just real briefly. Then I want to go through 4 examples of using Onshape alongside SolidWorks. And this is specific to the SolidWorks user, but I just wanted to give you 4 examples where we've seen a lot of Onshape users that are using SolidWorks really take advantage of all the powerful capabilities of Onshape. So 4 examples. I'll walk you through an example of each one of them. As I mentioned before, I do my best to answer any questions that you have. So feel free to type in anything into the questions dialog in your GoToWebinar control panel, and I'll do my best from time to time and stop and address them. So that's really the goal. Of course, I want to cover importing and exporting, which is very key to the working alongside workflow, and just kind of give you 4 examples where you might use Onshape if you're a SolidWorks user every day. So let's dig in. Now, I do have a few more slides. The first things I want to mention is import and export. And there's a lot more formats than just SolidWorks that are supported. So, of course, we can import and export SolidWorks parts, and that's on the list. But there are many other files as well. So I'm going to go through each of the different formats for parts, assemblies, and drawings. So bear with me. For import, we can import Parasolid, ACES, Step, and IGES, Inventor, CATIA V5, SolidWorks, ProE or Creo, JT, and Rhino files. And it's important to keep in mind this list is growing. As I mentioned before, we update quite frequently, and new files are added to this list quite often. Now, in terms of exporting, what can we export Onshape parts as? Parasolid, ACES, Step and IGES, SolidWorks, STL, and Rhino. Now, the question often comes up, well, if you can export a SolidWorks part, what format is it? And that's a commonly asked question. We wanted to make it as compatible as possible, so it's a 2004 file. So as long as you have a newer version of SolidWorks than 2004, you can read in the SolidWorks part that we are exporting and directly into SolidWorks. So we can, again, save a part as a SolidWorks part file. So those are the lists of importing and exporting of parts, a very important distinction, that's parts. Then we get into assemblies. Now, assemblies, of course, is a bit shorter list. We have Parasolid, ACES, Step and IGES, SolidWorks Pack and Go, which is very important to what we're talking about here today, JT, and also Rhino. And then, of course, export is Parasolid and Step. So we can export assemblies as Parasolid and Step. Now, this is the list for specific assemblies, and of course the details behind that are, we can read things like, for instance, in SolidWorks case, sub-assemblies and top-level assembly, and read that hierarchy and structure. So, the ability to import assemblies is, of course, pretty important to many users, and we can import many of the standards, including SolidWorks Pack and Go. Now, I have an asterisk next to that, and it's very important. I want to cover the details of importing a Pack and Go. I'm going to walk you through an example of importing a SolidWorks Pack and Go in just a second. So that is importing and exporting assemblies. The last one on my list is, of course, drawings. And we can import DXF and DWGs, and we can export DXF, DWGs, and PDFs. What that means for the SolidWorks user is that you will need to export your drawing as either a DXF or DWG in order to import it into Onshape and to have it translated and to be visible. So, important thing to point out, if you want to be able to see your drawings, they'll need to be imported as a DXF or DWG. Now, we're going to cover this in just a bit, but it's an important distinction. Remember that you can import any file into a document. So you can import a SolidWorks drawing file, for instance, into your Onshape document, but it will not be translated. If it's a DXF or DWG, it'll actually be translated, and you can see it natively in your browser, right, or on your mobile device. So, an important distinction. Now, I mentioned before there is an asterisk for those SolidWorks users with Pack and Go. And the details behind Pack and Go, if you're not familiar with it, SolidWorks uses a command called Pack and Go to essentially place all of the parts and all of the subassemblies and essentially the entire structure in one place. And it puts them all together, and it even has an option to create a zip file. So for those SolidWorks users out there, make sure when doing a Pack and Go to save it to a zip file and leave the name as the default. By default, it will name the top level assembly with a zip file name. Those names must match. So very important for those users. Make sure that the Pack and Go zip file name that's created from SolidWorks matches the top level assembly in SolidWorks. And that's really the only key. You save it to a zip file. That zip file is then imported and translated in Onshape. I'm going to walk you through that process in a bit. But very important thing, make sure to save to a zip file and leave the name as the default. If you change the zip file name afterwards, it will not translate. Okay. Question, import pictures to a drawing. You can import pictures into a sketch in your Part Studio. you cannot import into a 2D production drawing, but if you're trying to import a picture into a sketch, you can do that today. You'd import the picture and use the sketch image command while in a sketch to insert it. Forgive me if that's not what you're asking. All right, so let's dig in. Now, I mentioned before we're going to walk through 4 examples, and of course there's many examples I could give you where Onshape is beneficial to use alongside just about any CAD system. But I've tried to highlight the 4 examples where I think the SolidWorks user is most benefited from Onshape. And I think the more common examples that we typically run into. So let's get started, and we're going to start with a very simple one, and that is, of course, using Onshape simply for cloud storage. There are many users out there who are just looking to back up their CAD data. And oftentimes you'll find them using something like Dropbox, Google Drive to accomplish this, right? Just to simply back it up. So if their hard drive crashes, they can get back all their files, right? Or if their backup crashes, or if worst case scenario, the whole building burns down and you lose everything, I can restore back from some kind of cloud storage service. So that's the idea, and many users will use something like a Google Drive or a Dropbox to accomplish this, and there's a number of disadvantages to that when you compare it to Onshape, and I want to go over a few of those. But the things to keep in mind, with Onshape you can store any file in a document. So it doesn't matter what the extension is. You can import and store any file no matter what the extension. So spreadsheets, PDFs, just think about anything project related can be stored in the document. So really think of a document as like a top level folder or a project level container for everything project related. So you can import not just your SolidWorks assemblies or parts. You can also import miscellaneous spreadsheets, PDFs, anything that you'd like. So again, you can store anything and think of it as a container for the entire project. Many of the file types can render in the browser. And we've already talked about many of them, things like SolidWorks and STEP and iGES and Parasolid, but also things like PDFs. You can view natively PDFs inside of Onshape, or text files or images or videos. So anything that your browser can render, you can view right inside of Onshape. You don't have to download the PDF, for example. And so oftentimes you'll have to send a link, and with a traditional cloud storage system, everything's kind of spread out in different places. So all of this inside of one document allows you to go from SolidWorks part to PDF to any other related data that's in the doc. Also, very much tying into what we're talking about here today, all of that data that you've imported, the SolidWorks files plus all the other project related data, can be version controlled. So if you have a major revision, you're done it in SolidWorks, you import it to Onshape, you have a major milestone, you capture it with a version, and it captures a version of everything in the document. So even the PDFs, even the SolidWorks part files, even the zip file, it captures a major milestone in the design. In your case, just a bunch of imported project-related data, but it's capturing it. And the neat thing is then you can go back and look at previous versions. And I can track revision A, revision B, revision C in the Onshape document. So it gives you the ability to store all this data. It gives you the ability to render all this data. And you can also version control all the data. And I think for a lot of users, that has much more functionality than you'd get with a typical Dropbox or Google Drive. And we'll talk about a number of other things that you can do as well. But those are the key things to point out. Now, as we get started, the important thing I want to point out just for the new users, okay, I have my SolidWorks part. Like, for example, we're going to go over the pack and go in a second. How do I get started? How do I first bring in my design from SolidWorks? And there's actually 2 places you can do this. I'm going to show you an example of both, but we're going to start with the easiest. And that is when you first log into the Documents page, you're going to see a big import icon in the top left. You select Import, and you browse to the SolidWorks file, whether it's your pack and go zip file, or in my case, this is a SolidWorks part file. Okay, so this is a SolidWorks part file. I hit Open. Right, it gives me my options, how big the file is, who owns it, do I want to make it public? In this case, I don't. I'm going to hit OK. and I have the option to process the direction that it's imported. And this is an important distinction. In Onshape, when you design something, the z-axis is what's referred to as up, and it's a small difference in the way CAD modeling kernels work, but or at least CAD modeling systems work. In the case of SolidWorks, for example, its y-axis is considered up, and it just makes a difference in that it's going to rotate the design in Onshape to z-axis up by default. But you can change that with the y-axis up check option here. So very important thing to point out, z-axis up is a standard in manufacturing and other places as well. So that's a standard for the way Onshape works. But if you want to use the SolidWorks method of y-axis up, you have that option. But that's it. I hit import, and it imports the file. So very simple, and that's it. I open the part up, and there it is. Okay. So there is no special steps. You don't have to hit any other buttons. You just simply import. It recognizes the extension, in this case SLDPRT, translates it so that it's automatically visible in Onshape. So the neat thing about this is, now I can share this with anyone. They don't need to install anything, right? They can just simply click a link and view the part. So from a accessibility perspective, maybe a collaboration perspective, this is much easier than sending someone a link to a part and then sending someone a link to a viewer that they have to download and install. It just really lowers that threshold for getting access to the data. Now, it's important to keep in mind, as I imported this is still private to me. No one else can access this document. But one of the neat things about this is, now I have this ability to share this if I wanted to. If I wanted to share this with the shop floor or with a vendor that I have. And again, they don't have to do anything special to see it. So some things I want to point out. First off, you have, in this case, this part was called seal retainer. So I have the seal retainer visible here. I have a tab for the seal retainer. And I also have a tab for the SLD PRT. And this is a tab for the original file. And the reason this is done is because when I right click, I can then come back and download this part file. So, just going back to that cloud storage idea, if I'm just looking to back this up, I can always come back and download the original part and then restore it back on my hard drive. Okay, so again, just from a simple cloud storage perspective, it's very nice. Now, I also mentioned that all of this data is version controlled. So anything that I import into this document, I can then manage versions and update the parts as time changes. But I also mentioned you can import anything. I want to show you an example of this. Now, as I mentioned before, you can import any file extension that you'd like. So it really doesn't matter. Now, many of them will actually render right inside of Onshape. So let me show you an example. Now, I've already shown you the first way to import, and that's from the Documents page. You have the big import icon. But there's two methods, and this is the second. If you go in while in a document, in this case, I'm already in my seal retainer document, I'd like to import some project-related files, maybe some PDFs, some spreadsheets, text files, just miscellaneous files that are project-related. In the bottom left corner, I select Create Tab, and I choose the Import command. Okay? Then just browse to the file I'd like to import. You can Shift select or Command or Control select, so you can select multiple files at once if you'd like. And I hit Open, and it imports all those files into the document. Okay? So each file has now its own tab. So here's the spreadsheet. Here's the text file. So here's a .txt, and notice again it's rendered natively. Here's a PDF. Right? Again, rendered natively. You have zoom in and out and scroll up and down. I have things like Word docs. So again, think of anything that is project related that you might want to store. And the neatest thing about this is, many of these will render in the browser. Think of PDFs and pictures and videos and text. But you can version manage all of this. So the SolidWorks part, all the miscellaneous files that I've imported, I can then come up and create a version. And this is an important idea to the version control in Onshape. You select the version manager from the top here, select Save Version, and I could say, okay, this is revision A. Okay, hit save, and now I have that major milestone. So if I come back 6 months later and decide I need to update this part with changes that I made in SolidWorks, I can do that. And I can always go back and look at revision A. And so there's an important point that I want to make here. A few things. You can save a version. There's versions here at the top. You hit save. You give it a name. It's very simple, which means you can go back and look at that version just by left-clicking on it. But more importantly, it means you can select and update any one of the tabs that you've imported from earlier. So I can update the SolidWorks part, I can update the text file that was associated with it, and I get that version control along the way. Okay? So that's the idea behind it, is you have this cloud storage tool that gives you the ability to render many of these things natively in the browser, right? So I can actually see the SolidWorks part in the browser, or people I share with can see it. But you get the version control and all the other benefits built in as well. So that is my first example, and again, that's just using Onshape just for cloud storage, nothing else besides I need a way to back up and store my data. Maybe occasionally share it, but the neat thing is, with the ability to back up and store and view your data in a browser, you also get version control. And this is a good question. On the update, does the translated geometry update automatically? It will create another tab in this case with the with the updated geometry. That is something that we're hoping to improve here soon. Right now, it will create a separate tab with a new version, and then you'll have the history showing when that tab was added. But a very good question. The answer today is no. It will create another tab. All right, so moving on, using Onshape to collaborate with vendors, and I think this is a scenario where we've all, as a long-time traditional CAD user, whether it's SolidWorks or whatever it may be, oftentimes it involves sending a lot of emails with a lot of email attachments of files to vendors to get quotes and whatever the process may be. But in general, I need to send someone a CAD file and have them quote on the process, whatever it happens to be, whatever vendors that I may be interacting with. And this is a scenario where Onshape can be really beneficial because, again, it's not email attachments, downloading viewers, and there's a lot of built-in tools that can help you here. So let's get into it. Now, the big thing with collaborating with your vendor is typically this is done with some kind of an email today, right? You send an email, or maybe it's a chat message and you send someone a link to a uploaded file, or you attach the file. But either way, you need to upload and attach and then send the file to someone. In this case, sharing is the big benefit that I want to point out here, because once the data is in Onshape, you can share it with anyone and you can collaborate inside of the document. And there's a few things I like to point out. The first is you do have some direct editing tools within Onshape. So if I'm trying to make some simple edits to the SolidWorks models, you can. Things like move face and delete face and resizing fillets and all that are very easy to do right inside of Onshape. So there are scenarios where you can make edits to the models and never have to go back to SolidWorks and do the whole update. But also the ability to export. And I think that's the key thing, because oftentimes I send a file to someone and they say, hey, I need this SolidWorks file in version 2010 because I don't have the latest version, or I need it as a step file, but you sent me an IGES. If I share the document with them, they can choose the format they want to export. Right? So as long as I give them that permission, they can say, okay, I can choose an IGES or I can choose a step file. So I don't have to do this back and forth with deciding what formats they need. So export capabilities allow the vendor to, export whatever they need, whatever their needed format is. But the big thing I want to point out here is sharing. So let's jump into this now. Let's jump back into Onshape here, and I'm going to go back to the documents page, and I want to create a new document. Okay, so I'm going to create a new blank document. We're going to call this Come Along. Okay. Now, I'm creating a new document, but the process is really the same whether we import from the Create tab menu here or we hit the big import icon. What I would like to show you, though, is importing a SolidWorks pack and go. Now, I mentioned before we can import the entire SolidWorks assembly as a single pack and go zip file. So if you save it as a zip file, you just import it into the document. The key thing to keep in mind, as I mentioned before, is make sure to not change the zip file name and leave it as the default. If you do that, you can simply import, right? Browse to your zip file. In this case, it's the comealong.zip, and open it. Okay? You get the same option as before to import with the y-axis up. You also have the option to import a file to the Part Studio, and this is very important for importing assemblies. When you import an assembly, remember it recognizes the sub-assemblies and so on. If you want the entire assembly in one Part Studio, you can check this option, and it will import the file to a single Part Studio. It's what's referred to as flattening it. I'm not going to do either. I hit import, and it imports the zip file. Okay, so it imports it first, and then it translates the zip file so that I can actually see it in the browser. And both of these processes go rather quickly. The thing to keep in mind here is, again, it recognizes the complete structure of the subassemblies. So here I have the top level assembly called Come Along. Right, here's the SolidWorks assembly called Come Along, but then I also have the handle subassembly with all its parts. Okay, so it will recognize that structure. Now, again, if your goal was to make everything a single Part Studio, you can certainly do that as well. So some things to keep in mind. Again, we have the subassembly structure. So here's the zip file. As I mentioned before, the original file is kept as a tab. And the idea behind this is you can right-click and download that zip file at some point in the future. Right? And you can always restore a backup or even export update with any changes. Okay. So comealong.zip is left, but then you have all the subassemblies. Now you also have a tab for all the parts. So if I left click this tab here, you'll see all the parts of this assembly are brought together. The key thing I want to point out with this is they're imported into this Part Studio in the orientation they were modeled. So it looks like all the parts are sitting on top of each other, and they are. But the reason for that is how they were modeled. They're all modeled, in bottom-up method, right? If I had modeled this in a top-down method where all the parts are, relative to the origin in that way, they'd come in imported that way. But there are some things we can do to simplify this process. And I mentioned before, what if I needed to make a design change? What if, I have some problem that I've run into? And so you can make some simple edits. If I right-click, for instance, this part, I can say hide all the other parts. That's an easy way to get rid of all the other parts. And I can even hide some of these surfaces. And by the way, we do import surfaces. And so now I have just this one part. And of course, we've decided, I consulted with my vendor. They figured out that the holes are too small, let's say. And so I can make that simple change without going back to SolidWorks. I can select, for instance, a simple move face, select my faces, right, do an offset, and then just grab and drag. Now, if I want to enter a specific number, I can certainly do that. So let's make this 1/8 of an inch bigger. I'll hit the green check, and now I've changed my hole diameter by 1/8 of an inch. So key thing to keep in mind, you can make those simple changes on the fly. You don't need to. Now, we're talking about move face and delete face and modifying fillets and things like that. But if it's a simple tweak, it's very easy to make inside of Onshape. So the next thing I want to mention is, I've made this change. I'd like to get the machine shop, for instance, that's making this thing. I'd like to get them to be able to download the DXF or maybe a Parasolid. So how do I do that? And the key thing there is sharing the document. Now, when I click share, there are a few things I want to point out. And if you've ever used Google Docs, it's a very similar type of workflow. You select share, you enter their email address, right? And then you define their permissions. A very important thing to point out, what kind of permission do you want to give this person? if you're comfortable with giving them the edit permission, you certainly can. This gives them the ability to edit the model, and you can even edit the model together in real time, so you can simultaneously work on the same part of the same assembly. And there are many users out there who, may model all the parts in SolidWorks, and then they just import all their SolidWorks parts and have 5 or 10 people assemble it at the same time. So you can work together if you give them edit permissions, and there are 2 edit permissions: edit and share, which gives them the ability to share the document or just simply edit. And you have 2 view permissions: view and comment, and just simply view. And like the names imply, just simply viewing gives them just the ability to view, whereas can view and comment allows them to add comments to the document. It allows you to chat together in the document. So a very important thing to point out: can edit and share is the permission I'm going to define, but very key, what kind of control do you want to give them? In this case, I hit share, and they're given instant access. So the key thing to keep in mind is they don't have to download anything. They can be looking at the same model you are within seconds. In fact, if you give them the edit and share permission, you actually see indications that they're in the document. As I mentioned before, you'll see a little cue here letting you know that you're working together in real time on the models. You could do things like, if you needed to, edit the appearance, you could work together and change the appearance of the model, and you're going to see it live update. You'll see new features being added. So if the person you're collaborating with decides to add a feature, you're going to see visual feedback letting you know they're working on this part. So just a neat thing to keep in mind, if you're working together, you can work simultaneously together. You don't have to worry about who has what file checked out, or who has write permissions, or where's this file at. With Onshape, everyone's working on the same document at the same time, the same models at the same time. So how does my user export? I've shared it with the machine shop. They need a DXF of this part to export. How do they accomplish that? And there's a few things to keep in mind with export. If all I wanted, for instance, was a DXF of this face, maybe I'm cutting this out on a water jet, for instance, you can right-click the face and say export as DXF. So that's one of the easiest ways. You can also right-click a sketch and say export as DXF, just as a bit of a tangent there. But you define DXF or DWG, you define the release version that you want, and you hit export, and it saves it as a DXF. So it's very easy for me as the machine shop, or whatever my role is, to save this as a DXF, just right-clicking on it. Now, if you want a 3D model, a step IGES Parasolid, all those that I mentioned earlier, you can export from a few places. Remember, this is actually a lot of parts together. If I want to export all of the parts, I could right-click the tab and choose Export, and you'll get the list: ACES, Step, IGES, SolidWorks, Rhino, STL, the list that I was mentioning earlier. So it's real simple. This will export all the parts, but you can also right-click an individual part. So what if I wanted a step of just this pulley side plate? I right-click, Export, and then choose my version. My format. So very easy. The right click, I think, is the key thing to point out there. The right click, whether you're right clicking in the part list or on the tab itself, that's where you'll find export. Okay. So again, if I'm sharing with the machine shop, they need a step file. They can right click, save the step file themselves. All right, now let's jump back. Number 3, my third example is using Onshape as a design review tool. And this does have some overlap with working with vendors. Sometimes I'm trying to share with vendors, but I also want them to review it and tell me, are there going to be any machining issues? Are there going to be any welding issues with this? And I can communicate with them as a design review. But I think this is also very useful if I'm trying to communicate with an end customer, or if I'm trying to communicate with my manager, and I need a simple way to share my model with them and have them be able to give me feedback, whether it's comments or just maybe we're sitting in a phone call and they want to be able to see what hole are you referring to, or what fillet are you referring to. Onshape has some great tools that help you communicate when you're shared like this. So let's get into that. Now, the big things here, there are 2 things I always like to point out when we talk about design reviews or more collaboration in general. The first is follow mode. So if I'm sharing with my vendor, or if I'm sharing with my manager, or if I'm sharing with my customer, and they're saying to me, well, I can't see what fillet you're talking about, or I can't, which hole are you talking about? And we're sitting there discussing it. A lot of times what you'll do is you'll take a screenshot, you'll mark the screen, you'll send an email, and then a lot of this back and forth with marking up screenshots or trying to depict, what it is you're referring to. Follow mode allows you to see their screen in real time. So they can point out the exact thing that they're talking about. So if I'm having an issue pointing out a fillet, for example, I can double click on his icon. It takes me into follow mode, and now I'm seeing his screen in real time. So he can point out those issues. The other thing I want to point out here is comments. So if I've shared this with, again, any one of those people that I was just discussing, they can leave comments, assuming I've given them permission. They can leave comments regarding my design. They can even tag features with comments. So I can right-click a face and say, is this the right color? And it will tag the comment with the face so that when they select it, they can see that. And so you can chat inside the document with comments. You can tag features with comments. There's all kinds of neat things that make it a great design review tool. So let me show you an example of this. Now, just jumping out here, back to our example. So I've shared this with my machine shop. And one of the first things I want to do is figure out, okay, is this hole diameter the right size? And, maybe we're discussing back and forth, and I want to see what it is he's talking about, or this person is talking about that I'm working with. As I mentioned before, you can see their screen in real time. To do this, just double click their social cue. So the little icon, the little indication that they're in the document, if you double click on that, you're then seeing their screen in real time. Right? So they can rotate the model, they can zoom in and out, and they can use the pointer to point to things they may be referring to. So maybe saying this fillet is too small, or this hole is too large. And I can easily, use the cursor to indicate, what it is I'm referring to. So again, the key thing here is, I'm not sending screenshots with markups back and forth via email. I can just use follow mode, double click, and I can see their screen in real time. They can point out exactly, what they're referring to. Now, to exit follow mode, all you do is left click anywhere in the graphics. So if I left click in the graphics, it exits follow mode. So I'm no longer looking at their screen. But what's neat about this is it takes me to the exact orientation that I was looking at on their screen. So I don't have to then rotate the model back around to see it in the position I was just looking at. It leaves me right as I was looking, on their screen. So a neat tool, definitely worth checking out if you haven't already. That's follow mode. You just double click their social cue, and again, instant seeing their screen, they can point out different things. Now, follow mode is one element of this, but the other is the comment capabilities. And the comments are really neat just because it gives me a unified place to talk to the people that I've shared the document with. So if I select comments here in the top, I can say, does this look good? Real simple, hit add. Now, anyone in this document that has it open is going to get a little indication here that a comment has been added. And this gives me the ability to say, to essentially chat back and forth, right? So if I reply, you'll get instant feedback. So here I can see one reply, left click, is the hole diameter right? Right, so now we can communicate back and forth. Now, it's not just general comments and replies, which you can do. You can also get email notifications. If you check the box to receive comment emails, you can get comment email notifications. But I think this is really neat because you can right-click, for instance, a feature, and you can say add a comment. So I can right-click the edge of this hole and say, is this diameter right? And the neat thing about that is when the other user logs in, they see that feature tagged in their model, right? So if I close this out, as soon as I select comment, notice it highlights a little comment tag next to that feature. If you left click, it will actually highlight the comment. So very neat. It's actually tagging a specific feature, and it makes it easy to communicate with a customer or vendor and say, hey, is this what you're looking for? Or for them to communicate with you with the same thing. Is this right? Now, another question that often comes up, and it very much ties into what we're talking about here today, is, well, how do I know it's right? And especially in the case of imported models, but how do I know what the size of this hole is? And the question often comes up, do you have a tool like Measure if I wanted to import something and just tell the diameter, for example? And the answer is yes, it's actually built in. So when you select any feature, Measure pops up in the bottom right corner. So you see if I select that edge, it tells me the diameter is 5/8. If I select it, it gives me all kinds of breakdowns about the details of where it's at. But you can select anything. If I select a face, it gives me the area. If I select 2 circles, for instance, it gives me the minimum distance, but I can also see center distance and all kinds of other details. So you have integrated measure tools. It's just a matter of having highlighted geometry. Any highlighted geometry, Measure automatically comes up. Okay? And you can get more detailed if you select the flyout here. Okay? All right, so the key things I want to point out there, of course, follow mode. If you double click their icon, you see their screen in real time. And comment capabilities. The ability to tag features with comments and communicate inside of a document makes it great for design reviews where you're trying to get approval, or maybe you're just trying to have someone review your design before you move on. All right, so my last example is really about accessibility. And I think for a lot of CAD users for many, many years, CAD has been, the models themselves have been only visible to the engineering department. It's not because they don't want to share, it's because it's been cost prohibitive or, in general, time prohibitive to share. It often has meant you had to buy software or at the very least download a large download of free software just to view the files that were being sent to you. And that's not very practical in a lot of situations. If I'm trying to convince my manager to look at the model, I don't want to also have to explain that he needs to spend 30 minutes downloading a viewer and installing a viewer. So the idea behind Onshape is, we're not just using this as a, rethinking a CAD tool, but increasing accessibility for anyone that you want to share with. Think of shop floor. If I want to share all my models with the shop floor so they don't have to walk around with paper prints, I can do that, right? It's free. They can create an account, and they can even access these drawings from their phone or from any, Android phone or iPhone or tablet. So increasing accessibility. And I think if you think of Onshape in that way, you can really open up your CAD data to a lot of areas you may not have thought about before. So think of the salesman that's out in the field working with the customer, and they want to be able to show them the status of the model or show them what it's going to look like. They can do that with their phone or their tablet, right? You share the model, you give them view-only permissions. They can open it up, look at it, and even let the potential customer rotate model and look at it. So accessibility, it's not just sales, but think of shop floor. If I wanted to share my drawings with the shop floor, if I'm printing out paper, I can have them open it up on their Android phone or their iPad. And also management. If I'm trying to share with management, asking them to download and install software is not the most fun thing in the world. And oftentimes they're going to, not have time for it. So really accessibility in general. Now, I mentioned the mobile app, and I mentioned all of this working on a mobile device. And it certainly does. If you haven't tried the Onshape app yet, I definitely recommend it. There's an app for iOS as well as Android. I'm going to jump out here real quickly and show it to you. So bear with me for just a second. So the Onshape app, again, this is running on an iPad. It could be an iPhone. It could be an Android phone or tablet. The interface is very similar. How everything works, very similar. But the big thing I want to point out here is just the capabilities of it. When I go in and I open the Onshape app, I can open up the same model that we were working with. So this is the SolidWorks assembly that you were looking at just a few minutes ago, right? This is now the same assembly that I have open in the browser. In fact, if you look, you'll see, let me jump back here. Now there are 2 other collaborators. I now have it open on the iPad, and of course I have it open in the other browser session that I shared with. So, and the neat thing about this is, we can chat together. We can see each other's screen. So I can even see, someone on the desktop. If I'm on my iPad, I can see their screen. So you get full-blown, CAD editing tools plus collaboration tools built in with the Onshape mobile app. All right, and so here's the comment capabilities. All of that stuff is built in here as well. And again, if you haven't played with the Onshape app, just an aside, it is a full-blown CAD editing tool. So you can build features. I can test motion out. I can build parts from scratch using Onshape Mobile. So I definitely recommend checking out the app. But the big thing I want to point out with this is your drawings, you're sharing with the shop floor, or the models that you're sharing with the customer. The Onshape app and in general, using Onshape really increases the accessibility to your CAD data to those you decide to share it with. So it really opens up a lot of avenues that you may not have considered before. So that is what I had planned. I'm going to stick around and answer any questions. So again, feel free to ask any questions that you'd like. Just real quickly, going forward, if you haven't already, we really encourage you to try Onshape in your professional work and let us know what you think. We're really interested in hearing from feedback from users. We've built a feedback mechanism into Onshape. It's in the help menu, and we've made it very easy to give us feedback. So we really encourage you, please let us know what you think. We're taking all that very seriously. Also, I've shown you how to share here today. Don't hesitate to share. Even if they don't have an Onshape account, we create one on the fly for them. So all they have to do is enter some basic information and they're in. And it's very easy to do. And again, they can be looking at the same model you are within seconds. The last thing I want to mention is if you've been using Onshape a while and maybe you're interested in meeting local users or establishing a local user group, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to help you set things up.